So now we begin a new set of lecture videos, this time on elections. After this lecture is over, you will be able to explain the concept of the median voter, which winds up being really important in political science. You'll be able to distinguish between primary elections and general elections. And you'll be able to distinguish between closed primaries and open primaries. This winds up being a really important distinction. I'm also going to talk about jungle primaries, but that won't be central to this particular lecture. I'm going to be talking about jungle primaries because that's what we have in California. You'll also be able to identify the kind of candidates that are most likely to win in the following elections: closed primaries, open primaries, and then general elections. And you'll be able to explain why moderate voters in the center of the ideological spectrum, are forced to choose between candidates with more extreme views in the general election. Now, I'm going to say this now and I'll repeat it throughout this lecture. When I talk about people having extreme views, that is not intended to be pejorative. It is not intended to be an insult. It's a spatial concept. It just means that whereas most voters are here, the people that they have to vote for in the general election are actually pretty far away from them in terms of their ideology, and I want to explain why. Then you'll be able to provide arguments in favor and against keeping the electoral college system. Now, most of you can probably come up with arguments against, and so the argument in favor is going to be the challenging part for me. You'll also be able to explain the difference between redistricting and gerrymandering. And you'll be able to explain how gerrymandering violates the one person, one vote rule. Now, elections are central to maintaining popular sovereignty. If you recall back to the very first lectures in which we talked about assessing democracy, popular sovereignty is the idea that people are in charge, that we get to select our rulers. And while I haven't talked about this thus far, the way it works is that in an election, people should be able to elect, or more accurately, vote for candidates who are closer to their own preferences, right? So if you're a liberal, you should be able to vote for a candidate who's a liberal. If you're a conservative, you should be able to vote for a candidate who's a conservative. And if you're a moderate, you should be able to vote for a candidate who's moderate. There should be a variety of choices, and at least some of the choices should match your own views. Well, the graph that you're looking at right now is a distribution of voters who vote in the general election. We refer to this as a normal distribution. Some people call it a bell curve. But what it's intended to display is that most voters are moderates. That is, most voters are in the center of the political spectrum. And the more you get away from the center of the political spectrum, so you go to people who are somewhat conservative or somewhat liberal, there's a lot of them, but not as many as there are moderates. Then as you go to conservatives and liberals, there's fewer of them. And then at the outer edges, the extremely liberal people and the extremely conservative people, there's the fewest number of those. Now, you wouldn't know it necessarily from watching television or listening to politicians talk, because probably a lot of the times what you hear is a lot of people who sound to be extremely liberal or liberal, and people who sound to be extremely conservative or conservative. Yet most voters are moderates. Well, you're not hearing things wrong. You're hearing things correctly. Because while it's true that most citizens are moderates, it's also true that most elected officials are on the more extreme ends of the ideological spectrum. I mean, let's go back to this picture with the normal distribution. If that's what citizens look like, If the majority of people are moderates, and then there's slightly fewer somewhat liberal and somewhat conservative people, and then even slightly less liberal and conservative people, and then even less extremely liberal and extremely conservative people, what should our leaders look like? If you had to draw a graph, a distribution of our leaders, what would it look like? Or what should it look like? Well, what I want to suggest to you is it should look the same way that the population looks. If the population is a normal distribution, then our leaders should look like the same thing. It should be a normal distribution. And yet it's exactly the opposite. There are a lot of people, a lot of leaders who are on the far right that are either extremely conservative or conservative. There are a lot of Democrats on the far left who are either extremely liberal or liberal. There are even fewer people who are somewhat liberal or somewhat conservative, and moderates are basically non-existent. The goal of this lecture is to explain how we got there. Why is that the case? And then I'm going to tell you what the solution is, or one potential solution. And here's a spoiler alert. If you're between the ages of 18 and 29, you're part of the solution, which means you're also currently part of the problem. But we'll get to that. So let's begin with some important distinctions. We're going to be talking about primary elections, and then we're going to be talking about the general election. For those of you who are sports fans, the way that you can think of it is primary elections are like the playoffs, and the general election is the championship game. Right? For those of you who aren't sports fans, hopefully you'll follow the rest of it because I don't have another example. If you come up with a good example, email it to me and I'll include it somewhere in the video, or I'll write an email to everybody. So first I'm going to talk about a standard primary. Now I didn't used to call it a standard primary, I just called it a primary, but California recently changed our rules, and so we now have what's called a jungle primary. So when I talk about a standard primary, I'm distinguishing it from jungle primaries. As of 2022, only 3 states do jungle primaries, and so I'm going to focus mostly on what I'm calling standard primaries. In a standard primary, what happens is that candidates from the same party run against one another for the party's nomination. If you win the party's nomination, then you go on to the general election. But in a standard primary, what happens is there are 2 separate ballots. So if you go to a polling station, and let's say you're a registered Republican, and you walk in and you say, I want to vote, they look on your registration and they see that you're a Republican and they hand you a Republican ballot. And on that ballot, for the people who are running for office, it'll just all be Republicans. There may be some other things that you're voting on too, propositions, other things that you're voting on, but for the purposes of the primary, you're just going to be voting for which Republican you want to move on to the general election. And likewise, if you're a Democrat, when you walk into the polling station, you go in, and I should clarify that we're talking about closed primaries here. When you walk in, if your state has a closed primary, and I'll explain that in a second, you go ahead and there'll only be Democrats on the ballot. Only be Democrats. The way it works then is in a primary, the winner of the party's nomination is the one who gets the most votes. So and then those people would move on to the general election. So on the example I have on my lecture notes, in the Republican primary, I have Republican 1, Republican 2, Republican 3, and Republican 4 listed. Those would be the names on the ballot. Right. And by the way, there'll be multiple offices where you might be voting for just Republicans. So it could be governor, it could be the House of Representatives, it can be a senator, depending on if there's an election in the Senate, it could be the state assembly, it could be the state Senate. But they'll just be, if you're a registered Republican, it'll just be Republicans on the ballot. So Republican 1, 2, 3, and 4 are on the ballot. Whichever one gets the most votes wins. They don't need a majority, they just need what's called a plurality, more votes than anybody else. And so I bolded Republican number 3 to indicate that Republican number 3 got the most votes. While that was happening, in the same polling station, there were Democrats coming up, and they were voting for the Democratic primary. And I'm going to just assume, just for the sake of this discussion, that on the Democratic ballot for whatever office we're talking about, there were only 3 Democrats running. Democrat 1, 2, and 3. And once again, I bolded Democrat 2 to denote that Democrat 2 was the one who got the most votes. Now, you don't need to win a majority, you just need to win a plurality. You just need to get more votes than anyone else. Then what would happen is during the general election, Republican number 3, who won in the primaries, and Democrat number 2, who won in the primaries, would run against one another. So that's the connection between primaries and general elections. You have to win in the primary election to move on to the general election. In the next video, I'm going to be comparing primary and general elections in a different way. We're going to be talking about whether it's harder to vote correctly in a primary election or a general election, and I'll explain to you what I mean by voting correctly. In case you're wondering, voting correctly does not mean voting like Phil.